d4. Knight f6. c4. e6. Knight f3. d5. Indian defense, opening line. Knight c3. Knight b, d7. Queen's Gambit, decline. g3, out of opening book. Bishop g5, would have been in the Queen's Gambit, declined. Normal defense, transposed. Book opening. d takes c4. Black wins a pawn. Black is ahead by a pawn in material. Bishop g2, clears the way for a kingside castle. Rook b8. a4. Bishop b4, pins white's knight at c3 and enables the short castle. Castle kingside, frees white's knight at c3 from the pin. Castle kingside. Knight d2, attacks black's pawn at c4. e5, attacks white's pawn at d4. Knight takes c4, removes the threat on white's pawn at d4. e takes d4, threatens white's knight at c3. Queen takes d4, protects white's knight at c3 and attacks black's pawn at a7. Knight c5, protects black's pawn at a7 and threatens white's queen. Queen takes d8, attacks black's pawn at c7. Rook takes d8, protects black's pawn at c7. White wins a queen and 2 pawns for a queen and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop f4, pins black's pawn at c7 and attacks black's pawn at c7. Knight e6, removes the threat on black's pawn at c7. Bishop e3, slightly better is rook f d1. a6, slightly better is knight d4. Knight e5. Bishop d6, threatens white's knight at e5. Knight c4, moves it to safety. Bishop b4. Rook f c1, slightly better is rook f d1. Knight d4. Bishop takes d4. Rook takes d4, threatens white's knight at c4. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. b3, protects white's knight at c4. c6. h3. Bishop e6. e3, attacks black's rook at d4. Rook d8, moves it to safety. Knight e2. g6. Knight d4. Bishop d5. a5. h5. Rook a4, attacks black's bishop at b4. Bishop c5, moves it to safety. Bishop takes d5. Rook takes d5. Black wins a bishop for a bishop. Material is even. Knight e2. Bishop e7. Knight c3, attacks black's rook at d5. Rook b5 attacks white's pawn at b3. Knight d2 removes the threat on white's pawn at b3. Rook b4 moves it out of immediate jeopardy and blocks white's pawn at b3. Rook takes b4. Bishop takes b4, partially pins white's knight at c3, attacks white's pawn at a5, and blocks white's pawn at b3. Black wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Knight c4 frees white's knight at c3 from the pin and removes the threat on white's pawn at a5. Rook d8 seizes the open file. Knight a2 threatens black's bishop. Bishop e7 moves it to safety. Knight c3 moves it off the edge. Knight d5. Knight a4. Knight b4 blocks white's pawn at b3. King f1. Rook d3 attacks white's pawn at b3. Rook b1 removes the threat on white's pawn at b3. Knight a2. Rook a1 attacks black's knight. Knight b4 moves it to safety and blocks white's pawn at b3. Rook b1 protects white's pawn at b3. Knight a2. Rook a1 attacks black's knight. Knight b4 moves it to safety and blocks white's pawn at b3. Rook b1 removes the threat on white's pawn at b3. The game ends in a draw.